The morning of November 8, 1965, began with the dull hum of helicopter rotors slicing through humid air. The men of the 173rd Airborne Brigade descended into the jungle northwest of Bien Hoa, expecting another sweep through the tangled interior of War Zone D. Intelligence had reported enemy concentrations in the area, but few believed the Viet Cong would stand and fight. For many of the paratroopers, it was supposed to be a routine operation: march, search, make contact, then withdraw. Within hours, that illusion would vanish completely. The terrain itself seemed hostile. The jungle canopy was dense, the undergrowth almost impenetrable. Every footstep required effort. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and visibility barely extended beyond 20 yards. The enemy had chosen the ground carefully. Unknown to the Americans, the Viet Cong had fortified the ridges overlooking the narrow trail, constructing a lattice of spider holes and trenches camouflaged with roots and leaves. They were waiting for the sky soldiers to walk straight into their sights. Among the troops advancing that morning was Specialist Lawrence Joel, a medic attached to the 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry. At 36, he was older than most of the men in his platoon. Calm where others were restless, deliberate where youth was impulsive. His presence carried quiet authority. Joel's training was second nature: diagnose, stabilize, and move to the next man. He had learned in Korea that a medic's first weapon was composure. But Vietnam was not Korea. Here, the war was fought by shadows in the trees. The first burst of enemy fire erupted just before noon. Automatic rifles cracked from the high ground, followed by mortar explosions that shattered the calm. The lead platoon went down almost instantly, ambushed from 3 sides. Chaos rolled through the formation. Men dropped to the mud, shouting orders that were drowned by gunfire. The enemy had planned every inch of the engagement, using terrain and sound to amplify confusion. Joel was already moving before anyone ordered him to. He crawled forward under fire, his medical bag slung tight against his chest. Smoke and dust clouded the air, and the metallic tang of blood filled his nostrils. The wounded lay scattered, some calling out, others eerily silent. Joel reached the first man, patched a torn artery, and dragged him to a shallow depression for cover. Bullets chewed into the earth inches away. He didn't look up. The training took over, his hand steady, voice low and firm. "You're gonna be fine, just stay still." Then he moved again. When the sniper's round struck his right leg, the pain came like lightning. Joel's body pitched forward, but his instincts held. He tore open a field dressing and wrapped his thigh in seconds, cinching the cloth tight enough to stop the bleeding. There was no time to assess damage. The next call for help was already ringing out. He dragged himself toward it, pushing through brush that shredded his fatigues. He wasn't running for cover, a private recalled later. He was running for us. The jungle became a maze of sound. Screams, the thump of grenades, the hissing arc of tracer fire. The Viet Cong had cut the column in half, isolating Joel's unit. The Americans fought to regroup, but communication was gone. The radios were jammed or destroyed. Joel worked alone for nearly an hour, moving from one fallen soldier to the next. Twice he stopped only to reapply pressure to his own wound. A second bullet grazed his thigh, opening another cut, but he barely noticed. His world had shrunk to the circle of wounded men around him. As the firefight dragged on, the air turned gray with powder and smoke. Helicopters trying to reach the clearing were driven back by heavy fire from the ridgelines. Medics in other platoons later said they could hear Joel's voice on the radio, calm, measured, reporting casualties even as rounds cracked around him. He sounded like he was at a clinic, one lieutenant remembered. You'd never know he was bleeding. The battle lasted more than 5 hours. By late afternoon, ammunition was running low, and the ground was littered with shell casings. Joel refused to retreat. At one point, he crawled into open terrain to reach two men caught in crossfire. He shielded them with his own body while bandaging their wounds, ignoring the dirt kicked up by incoming rounds. A third man, seeing him fall and rise again, said later, "He made you believe you could live just by watching him move." When reinforcements finally reached the forward line, they found Joel limping but still upright, his uniform soaked in blood and mud. The field was silent, except for the groans of the wounded and the low crackle of burning brush. The medevac crews began lifting casualties, and Joel refused to board first. He insisted that others be taken before him. "I'm not done yet," he told the flight medic, pushing the stretcher aside. He worked another hour until the last of his platoon was evacuated. By the time he allowed himself to be carried out, the light was fading over the jungle. Hill 65, soon to be known as the Hump, was littered with the dead, Americans and Viet Cong alike. The official reports would later call it a tactical engagement of limited duration, but for those who survived, it was a lifetime compressed into an afternoon. For Joel, that day marked the moment when everything, fear, rank, prejudice, dissolved under the weight of duty. In a war where few acts of valor were ever witnessed in full, his stood out not because of the violence around him, but because of his persistence within it. He had not killed an enemy, captured ground, or led a charge. He had simply refused to stop saving lives. When the evacuation helicopters lifted off, the soldiers looked down at the scarred jungle and the small figure of the medic who had stayed until the end. Hill 65 had been meant to be another line on a map. Instead, it became a symbol of endurance and the beginning of a story that would force the Army to confront both its prejudices and its heroes. The fight that began in the late morning had turned into a test of endurance by midday. The men of the 173rd Airborne were pinned down, every attempt to maneuver answered by bursts of automatic fire from concealed enemy trenches. The terrain offered no shelter, just red soil, low shrubs, and a canopy that blocked sunlight but not bullets. The Viet Cong had shaped their defense perfectly, curving around the American column in a U-shape, cutting off escape routes and hammering the paratroopers from 3 directions. The soldiers had walked straight into a killing zone. The radio operators screamed into their sets for artillery or air support, but headquarters denied the requests. The lines were too close. Any shelling risked hitting their own. The sound of gunfire was constant, a mechanical roar punctuated by sharp cracks of sniper shots. The air shimmered with heat and smoke. In that inferno of sound, Specialist Lawrence Joel could distinguish the tones of different cries, the panicked, the fading, the ones already beyond reach. He chose the ones he still might save. He crawled low, dragging his medical bag through the mud. A mortar blast threw him sideways, showering him with dirt and leaves. He coughed, spat blood, and kept moving. The jungle around him was alive with motion, Viet Cong runners darting through undergrowth, tracers whipping past at chest height. Joel ignored it all. He knelt beside a young paratrooper with a stomach wound, slipped off his gloves, and pressed his hands directly over the opening. The soldier tried to speak, but Joel silenced him with a steady voice. "You'll make it, kid. Just breathe." His training had taught him sequence. Stop bleeding, clear airways, check for shock. But the battle destroyed order. He worked on instinct. He gave morphine when he could, water when he couldn't. Once, when his medical kit ran empty, he tore the sleeve off his own shirt and tied it around a soldier's neck wound, knotting it with his teeth. The act drew fire from a nearby tree line. Bullets ripped through the branches overhead, but he didn't flinch. By mid-afternoon, Joel had been on his knees for hours. His leg wound had reopened, seeping blood through his fatigues, but he ignored it. Crawling through grass slick with blood, he dragged 2 wounded men toward a cluster of trees that offered slight cover. His helmet was gone. His hands were raw from dirt and friction. Still, he moved deliberately, never rushing, never shouting. To those who saw him, his calmness was almost unnatural, an anchor amid panic. A corporal later said that Joel seemed to appear wherever someone fell. "You'd think there were 3 of them out there," he recalled. He'd patch one guy up, then you'd hear his voice 50 yards away doing it again. The men stopped calling for medic and began yelling his name directly. "Joel, over here!" That sound, his own name shouted through the chaos, drove him forward. It meant someone still had a chance. When he ran out of supplies, he crawled back to the rear of the formation, where the supply sergeant crouched behind a burned-out tree. The man tried to hand Joel a morphine syringe, seeing his injuries. Joel refused it, grabbing only bandages and plasma bags before returning to the front. The sergeant later said he'd never seen anyone move like that, like the bullets didn't matter. The hours bled together. The jungle floor turned into a mire of bodies, shell fragments, and shattered branches. The stench of sweat, gunpowder, and iron filled the air. The medics who could still move followed Joel's lead, but none matched his pace. Several soldiers recalled seeing him carry a wounded man on his shoulders while limping, using a rifle as a crutch. He laid the man down gently, checked his pulse, and went back again. As the afternoon dragged on, the intensity of the fire eased only for minutes at a time, just long enough for the wounded to cry out again. Joel moved constantly, his exhaustion hidden behind focus. "If he's still standing," one paratrooper muttered, "then so are we." Those words spread through the lines like a promise. It gave the men something to hold on to when the command structure disintegrated. By late day, the enemy shifted tactics. Instead of charging, they began sniping from the flanks, aiming for medics and radio operators. Joel became a deliberate target. A bullet clipped the strap of his medical bag, sending it spinning off. He retrieved it under fire, crawling backward until he reached another casualty. A grenade exploded nearby, throwing dirt and metal into his face. He blinked the grit from his eyes, checked his patient's breathing, and moved on. As daylight faded, the noise of battle merged into an unbroken drone. Helicopters circled overhead, searching for openings to land, but the clearing was too hot with fire. The wounded lay in clusters now, each man too weak to move. Joel worked by the dim light of burning trees and sporadic flares fired from M79 grenade launchers. He used those brief flashes to find wounds, his hands trembling only when the light went out again. When night came, the temperature dropped sharply, and the jungle filled with a new sound. The moans of the injured, mixing with insects and the distant rumble of artillery. Joel could barely feel his legs, but he kept moving from body to body, whispering reassurances, checking pulses, tightening tourniquets. Getting them home alive, he would later say, was the only thought left in his mind. By the time the shooting stopped, Joel had treated nearly half the battalion's wounded. His uniform was soaked in blood, much of it not his own. Of the 48 men who survived the ambush, more than 20 were directly saved by his hands. When the medevacs finally landed in the darkness, the stretcher teams found him still kneeling beside a soldier, adjusting a bandage as if the battle hadn't ended. The night on Hill 65 became legend in the 173rd Airborne, not because of the fight itself, but because of what one medic had done in its shadows. While others counted bodies and ammunition, Joel counted breaths. He had turned chaos into purpose, proving that even in the heart of an ambush, compassion could be stronger than fear. When the helicopters lifted away, carrying the wounded through smoke and moonlight, Joel refused to board the first one. Only after every casualty had been loaded did he allow himself to be lifted out. His exhaustion hit him only then, a deep, hollow ache that settled into silence. He had spent the longest afternoon of his life not as a soldier fighting to kill, but as a man determined that others would live. The dawn after the battle came without ceremony. No birds, no breeze, only the distant crackle of burning brush. The mist hung low over Hill 65, carrying the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. The men of the 173rd Airborne moved in silence, stepping carefully among the shell craters that marked where the worst fighting had raged. What daylight revealed was devastation. The jungle had been shredded by artillery, trees splintered into toothpicks, the soil turned over by grenades. Dozens of American bodies lay where they had fallen, tangled in vines or slumped beside rifles that had jammed in the heat of battle. Lawrence Joel sat on a stretcher near the edge of the clearing, his uniform stiff with dried blood. The medics who found him were surprised to see him alive. His right leg was swollen and discolored from 2 bullet wounds. His fatigues were torn in half a dozen places. But when they tried to load him into a helicopter, he resisted. "There's others worse off," he said, pointing toward a line of wounded soldiers awaiting evacuation. The other medics hesitated. Orders were orders. But Joel's tone left no room for argument. Even now, bleeding and feverish, he was directing care as if the fight hadn't ended. The field hospital at Bien Hoa received its first wave of casualties by mid-morning. Joel arrived only after every other wounded man from his platoon had been treated or evacuated. When the attending surgeon cut away the bandages on his leg, he found the wounds packed with mud and improvised dressings, evidence of hours spent crawling through the jungle under fire. He should have been dead from infection, one doctor later wrote. Yet even as they worked on him, Joel kept asking for casualty lists, making sure his men were still alive. News of what he had done began spreading through the brigade almost immediately. It started with the survivors, the men who had watched him limp across the battlefield, who had seen him ignore his own blood loss to save others. Their accounts reached the officers, then the staff tent, then the colonel's desk. At first, some doubted the reports. A single medic treating that many men under those conditions sounded exaggerated, even impossible. But the testimonies kept coming. By evening, it was clear that what Joel had done was not a rumor, it was fact. For many in the 1703rd, the realization carried an extra weight. The Army of 1965 was still an institution divided by habit and prejudice. African American soldiers often found themselves pushed into support roles, denied promotions, or overlooked for leadership. Yet Joel's conduct at Hill 65 defied every stereotype that still lingered in the ranks. One officer admitted privately that he had never seen a Negro soldier handle pressure like that. Others, less willing to say it aloud, quietly acknowledged that courage had no color. Among the enlisted men, however, there was no hesitation. For them, Joel's actions became legend overnight. "He kept us alive," one survivor said simply. "When we were done fighting, he was still fighting, just in a different way." In the camp at Bien Hoa, paratroopers began repeating his name as a kind of shorthand for endurance. "Do it like Joel did," they said, when someone faced an impossible task. It became a phrase that meant, "Don't quit, no matter what." In the days that followed, the brigade returned to routine patrols, sweeping through areas north of Saigon. The jungle swallowed their tracks quickly, as if erasing evidence of the battle. But the men carried its memory with them. The next time gunfire erupted, many instinctively called for their medics first. And though Joel was back at headquarters recovering, the standard he'd set guided how others moved under fire. Reports from junior officers noted that morale remained strong despite casualties, though few realized that the morale they described had a human source, a medic who had proven that discipline and compassion could coexist even in hell. The paperwork to recommend Joel for commendation began soon after. His company commander filed a report citing exceptional bravery and devotion to duty. But in the bureaucracy of the Vietnam War, recognition moved slower than rumor. Months passed before the nomination reached division headquarters. Joel, meanwhile, refused to dwell on it. When his wounds began to heal, he requested reassignment to medical duties, insisting he could still serve. "I didn't join to be thanked," he told a reporter later. "I joined to do the job." At Bien Hoa, he became something of a symbol. Younger medics sought him out, eager to learn how he had stayed calm under fire. His advice was always the same. You can't panic if someone else already is. One of you has to stay steady. He taught by example rather than speech, moving quietly through the wards, checking on men he'd once treated in the field. Some would call out his name as he passed, "Doc Joel," and he'd answer with a nod, never staying long enough for applause. When the brigade rotated out of War Zone D for refit, Joel limped with a cane. The bullet fragments in his leg had not been fully removed. He would carry them for the rest of his life. Yet the limp seemed to add to his aura rather than diminish it. To his fellow paratroopers, it was a mark of proof that even broken, he'd refused to fall. The Army's official narrative of Operation Hump would eventually describe sustained engagement with superior enemy forces resulting in heavy casualties. Nowhere did it mention the medic who had turned chaos into survival. But within the 173rd, his reputation grew in the telling. Veterans recalled not the generals or the orders, but the sight of a calm, wounded man kneeling beside the fallen, unshaken by the storm around him. In a war where so many acts of courage vanished into the jungle, Joel stood out precisely because it was seen, witnessed, remembered, and repeated until it became part of the brigade's identity. The men didn't need medals to know what he had done. They had lived it. And as they prepared for the next mission, one phrase carried through the ranks like a quiet vow: "Do it like Joel did." By the time the 173rd Airborne returned to full strength, the legend had outpaced the paperwork. For the Army, the battle at Hill 65 was one line in a campaign report. For the soldiers who had survived it, it was something far more personal. The day a soft-spoken black medic from North Carolina proved that courage, when tested by fire, speaks louder than any order ever written. The Medal of Honor recommendation moved slowly through the channels of the U.S. Army bureaucracy, passed from field command to division, from Saigon to the Pentagon, and finally to the Department of the Army in Washington. Months became a year. By the time the paperwork reached the president's desk, the war had already escalated far beyond what Joel and his comrades could have imagined. The fighting in Vietnam now stretched from the Delta to the DMZ, and American casualties had risen into the tens of thousands. Yet, in the middle of that expanding tragedy, the story of one medic had refused to fade. Officers who had witnessed Joel's actions wrote letters of endorsement, describing his extraordinary composure and total disregard for personal safety. The language was clinical, but the sentiment was unanimous. What he had done at Hill 65 transcended duty. The ceremony took place in the East Room of the White House, under the chandeliers that had witnessed both state dinners and declarations of war. Rows of uniformed generals stood beside politicians and reporters. Joel entered wearing his Class A dress uniform, his posture straight despite the stiffness in his leg. He had never imagined standing in such a place. When President Johnson pinned the medal to his chest, the applause was restrained but sincere. The president's words echoed through the hall. "In Sergeant Joel's bravery, we see the best of America, devotion that rises above race, rank, or fear." For a moment, the sentence hung in the air, both proud and revealing. Those listening understood what Johnson meant, but also what he implied. The need to mention race at all reminded many how rarely men like Joel had been recognized in the first place. Among the black officers and enlisted men watching on television from barracks and mess halls across the world, there was pride, but also quiet frustration. It had taken a decade after desegregation for the nation to honor a black soldier's heroism without hesitation. Still, Joel's medal marked a break in the wall of indifference that had stood too long. Back at Fort Benning, Georgia, his former comrades gathered around a television to watch the broadcast. The men who had fought beside him, some now missing limbs, others still bearing scars, cheered when his name was read aloud. They remembered the mud, the chaos, the voice that had steadied them. One veteran later said, "When that ribbon touched his chest, it felt like it touched all of ours too." The news traveled quickly through the ranks of the 173rd Airborne, and by evening it had reached units scattered across Vietnam. To many serving on distant fire bases, the story became a lifeline, a reminder that what they did and risked mattered. Letters began arriving within days. They came from soldiers in the field, from veterans groups, from school children who had read his story in newspapers. Civil rights leaders sent messages of congratulations, framing his act as proof that patriotism and equality could coexist. One letter, written by a mother whose son had died in the same battle, thanked him for being the one who tried to bring them all home. Joel read every message carefully, often late at night when the noise of attention quieted. He responded to as many as he could, signing them simply L. Joel, U.S. Army Medic. In his hometown of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the celebration was unlike anything the city had seen in years. The mayor declared a Lawrence Joel Day, and the streets filled with neighbors, families, and veterans waving flags. For a community that had sent many sons to war but received few headlines, Joel's return was a moment of unity. He walked in the parade with his wife and children, smiling shyly at the crowds. To reporters asking about the honor, he gave the same answer each time: "I just did what I was trained to do." To him, the medal wasn't about triumph, it was about survival. Even amid the accolades, Joel remained wary of being called a hero. When interviewed by an Army journalist, he said quietly, "There are a lot of medics still out there doing the same thing. The difference is, I came back." His humility only deepened the respect others felt for him. Officers who had served with him described him as steady under any fire, modest under any praise. Fellow medics called him a teacher, someone who made their dangerous job seem simple by example alone. His calmness, the same quality that had kept him alive in the jungle, never left him. The military, keenly aware of the public attention, began using Joel's story in training sessions for new recruits. Photographs of him receiving the medal appeared in Army newsletters and at induction centers. For many young black soldiers entering service during the turbulent years of the late 1960s, Joel's face became the image of possibility, proof that valor would no longer go unnoticed. His example stood in contrast to the social unrest at home, where civil rights battles still raged. In that sense, his recognition bridged two worlds, the war abroad and the struggle for equality within the United States. Yet Joel himself never allowed the medal to separate him from those he served with. When he returned to active duty as a medical instructor, he wore it sparingly, keeping it in a small case rather than on his uniform. He told students, "It's not for me, it's for the ones who didn't get out." To him, the honor was collective, not individual. It symbolized the quiet courage of every medic who worked under fire, every soldier who faced the impossible and kept going. By the end of that year, Joel had become more than a decorated veteran. He had become a symbol, not of perfection, but of persistence. His medal stood as both recognition and reminder that for too long valor had been filtered through the lens of race, and that true courage, when finally acknowledged, could help change the story of an entire army. For those who had served beside him, the White House ceremony was not the end of the story, but its confirmation. Sergeant Lawrence Joel had gone to Vietnam as a medic and come home as a message. The medal on his chest was made of metal and ribbon, but its meaning was heavier. It carried the memory of men who refused to die, of a war that demanded too much, and of a soldier who answered that demand without hesitation. After Vietnam, Lawrence Joel returned not to parades or politics, but to the only world he understood, the disciplined rhythm of Army life. He rejoined active service almost immediately, assigned first to the Medical Training Center at Fort Sam Houston, then later to various field hospitals and schools across the country. His new mission was quieter but no less vital: to teach a generation of young medics what courage truly looked like. He moved through classrooms with the same composure he had shown on the battlefield, never raising his voice, never exaggerating. His lessons were direct. Your first weapon is your hands, he told recruits. Your second is your head. Panic kills faster than bullets. In lecture halls filled with 20-year-olds headed for Southeast Asia, Joel's presence carried a gravity that no textbook could match. Many of the soldiers had read about him in training pamphlets or seen his photograph in the Army Digest. When he entered the room, silence followed. He didn't dramatize the battle that had made him famous. He described it as routine work under impossible conditions. What mattered, he said, was not heroism, but endurance. You do the job in front of you, he told them. Then you move to the next man. You don't stop counting until you run out of wounded or breath. He insisted that medics learn to treat everyone, ally, enemy, or civilian, with the same precision. Blood doesn't come in colors, he reminded them. The line became a kind of mantra in medical training schools during the late 1960s and early 1970s. His classes blended clinical skill with moral clarity, tourniquet technique, field triage, and what he called the discipline of stillness, the ability to stay focused under chaos. Recruits who trained under him recalled that he never tolerated bravado. Don't call yourself a hero before you've done the work, he would say, and if you've done it, you won't need to. Behind that calm exterior, however, the war had left scars that no medal could heal. Joel rarely spoke about his nightmares, but they came often. In the quiet hours of barracks nights, he would sometimes wake in a cold sweat, hearing phantom voices, the cries of men from Hill 65 calling for help that never came. His wife later said he could not sit through war movies. The sounds of helicopters or rain on tin roofs unsettled him. Yet he never sought pity. To him, the cost of service was personal, private, and unavoidable. Like many veterans of Vietnam, Joel struggled to adjust to the silence of peacetime. The absence of gunfire, he once admitted, felt heavier than the noise. He had spent years where every second mattered, where decisions were life and death. Now, the slow pace of everyday life brought an unfamiliar kind of unease. When asked in an interview how he handled it, he smiled faintly and said, "You keep moving. That's all any soldier knows how to do." By the early 1970s, the Army began to change around him. The painful lessons of Vietnam forced the institution to confront long-ignored realities, among them the service and sacrifice of black soldiers. Integration was no longer just policy but practice. Joel's name began to appear in training manuals and leadership courses as an example of integrity under fire. At Fort Benning and Fort Sam Houston, posters bearing his photograph hung in classrooms beside the words, "Calm saves lives." For young medics, he was both mentor and myth, a man who had turned compassion into discipline. Despite the growing recognition, Joel remained cautious about the attention. He knew the Army still carried its contradictions. At ceremonies honoring him, he often deflected praise toward others. "Medals don't stop bullets," he would remind officers. "They just tell you who caught one and kept going." His humility made him respected even among generals who rarely expressed admiration openly. Colonel Robert H. York, one of his former commanders, later wrote that Joel taught the Army something no regulation ever could: how to lead by example when no one is watching. In 1975, the nation's mood toward Vietnam had soured completely. Veterans returned home to indifference or hostility, and public memory of the war faded quickly. Joel, however, continued to serve without bitterness. He mentored younger medics who would later deploy to Cambodia and Laos, many of whom cited him as their model in letters and after-action reports. "We learned how to breathe under fire because he showed us how," one wrote. "If Sergeant Joel could walk through hell calm, then so could we." By the late 1970s, he had risen through the ranks to senior non-commissioned officer status, his reputation spreading through every branch of the medical corps. He was invited to speak at military academies and universities, where he emphasized the same principle again and again: equality in duty. You treat them all the same, friend or foe, officer or private. That's the rule of medicine and the rule of decency, he said during one address at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. His words resonated not only with soldiers, but with civilians who had begun to see the war's human toll differently. Despite his formal bearing, Joel remained deeply connected to the enlisted ranks. He joined them at mess halls, remembered birthdays, and wrote letters of recommendation for medics seeking promotion. His office walls were plain, no medals on display, only a small framed photo of his unit in Vietnam. He kept the Medal of Honor locked away, taking it out only when asked to speak at memorials or schools. "It belongs to them," he said once, gesturing to the photograph, "not me." By the time he retired from the Army in 1982, Joel had served more than 20 years, spanning 2 wars and 3 generations of soldiers. His farewell ceremony was modest, no parade, just a gathering of medics and officers who had learned from him. The commander who presented his retirement certificate called him the conscience of the Corps. Joel, true to form, said little. He thanked the men, reminded them to keep your kits ready and your hearts steady, and walked away on the same injured leg that had carried him through Hill 65. In the years that followed, his influence lingered in the way medics trained and thought about their work. His story was recounted in classrooms and field manuals, not as a tale of heroism, but as a lesson in responsibility. The young soldiers who never met him still learned his maxims by heart. Stay calm, treat everyone, and never quit. Within the medical corps, his name came to represent something enduring, that valor was not measured by combat alone, but by the lives saved in its shadow. When asked once how he wanted to be remembered, Joel answered without hesitation, "As a soldier who did his job." But those who had stood beside him knew it was more than that. In uniform or out, in war or in peace, Lawrence Joel had redefined what duty meant, not through speeches or slogans, but through the quiet, relentless act of doing what needed to be done, one wounded soldier at a time. When Lawrence Joel passed away in 1984 at the age of 55, his death barely made national headlines. There were no grand speeches or televised tributes, only a small funeral in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, attended by family, fellow soldiers, and a handful of men who still bore the scars of Hill 65. The service was quiet, fitting for a man who had spent his life avoiding the spotlight. Yet within that silence lay something far greater, the legacy of a soldier whose courage had outlasted the war that nearly killed him. In the years following his passing, his name began to reemerge, not through ceremony, but through remembrance. Veterans of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, many of them now old men, started organizing reunions to honor those who had fought in Operation Hump. At every gathering, one name came up without fail: Doc Joel. The men spoke of him not as a myth, but as a presence. The steady voice in the chaos, the calm hand that stopped the bleeding, the quiet figure who refused to fall even after being shot twice. Some remembered the exact moment they saw him crawl toward them through gunfire. Others simply remembered his words, "You're gonna be fine. I've got you." By the 1990s, historians and military researchers began re-examining the Vietnam War through a new lens, one that included the overlooked stories of African American soldiers. Within those studies, Joel's heroism stood out not just as a singular act, but as a milestone in a broader historical shift. His Medal of Honor citation had not merely recognized one man, it had broken a barrier. Before Joel, only a handful of black servicemen in American history had received the Medal of Honor, often decades after their actions. His award, given within 2 years of the battle, signaled the beginning of an institutional reckoning, a moment when valor could no longer be filtered by race. In 1997, more than 3 decades after Operation Hump, Winston-Salem made that reckoning visible. On a stretch of land just outside the city center, the U.S. Army dedicated a new multi-purpose arena in his honor, the Lawrence Joel Veterans Memorial Coliseum. It was the first major American memorial named for an African American Medal of Honor recipient. The building stood not only as a tribute to Joel, but to every soldier who had served and been forgotten. At the dedication ceremony, veterans of the 173rd stood alongside local citizens, their hair gray, their uniforms snug with age. One of them, a man Joel had dragged out of the jungle in 1965, wept openly as he touched the bronze plaque bearing Joel's likeness. "He never quit on us," he said softly. "Now we're not quitting on him." Inside the Army, Joel's influence endured long after his death. His actions became a case study at the Army Medical Department Center and School, where generations of medics were taught to see his example as the gold standard of battlefield conduct. In training simulations, instructors invoked his name when recruits hesitated under pressure. "Do it like Joel did," they'd say, echoing the same phrase that had spread through the 173rd Airborne more than 30 years earlier. To young soldiers who had never seen Vietnam, his story was both history and instruction. Courage defined not by aggression, but by persistence, compassion, and calm. Historians today often describe Joel's actions at Operation Hump as a quiet revolution. In a war remembered for chaos and controversy, he embodied something enduring, a reaffirmation of the soldier's duty to life amid destruction. Military analysts note that his Medal of Honor citation helped shift official attitudes toward African American servicemen in combat roles. After 1967, nominations for black soldiers began to rise steadily, and integrated recognition became policy rather than exception. The acknowledgement did not erase racism from the ranks, but it cracked the silence that had surrounded it. In that sense, Joel's valor was both personal and political, an act of humanity that forced an institution to face its own contradictions. For the men of the 173rd Airborne, however, the meaning of his legacy was simpler and more intimate. At reunions held decades later, survivors would pass around faded photographs of their younger selves, men half buried in jungle mud, faces streaked with sweat and fear. Inevitably, someone would point to a dark silhouette in the background, a medic crouched over a wounded comrade, head bowed in concentration. "That's Doc Joel," they'd say, their voices filled with both pride and disbelief that they were still alive to tell the story. Many carried small scars that they jokingly called their Joel signatures, reminders of the man who had patched them up when death was only a breath away. Over time, his name became more than a memory. It became a standard. The term Joel-type medic entered informal Army slang, referring to someone who stayed calm under pressure and never left a man behind. His story was told in field hospitals, at graduations, and in the quiet moments between missions when soldiers needed reassurance that courage could be steady, not loud. Even among officers who had never met him, his legacy served as proof that leadership could exist at any rank, that the strength of a unit often rested in the hands of those whose only weapon was mercy. In Winston-Salem, his hometown continued to honor him long after the headlines faded. Local schools taught his story as part of community history, And on Veterans Day, wreaths were laid at his memorial. His family, his wife, children, and grandchildren became custodians of his memory, ensuring that his example was not confined to the military, but carried into civilian life. For them, he was not a symbol, but a man who had done what needed to be done, without expectation of reward. He didn't want to be remembered as a hero, his daughter once said. He wanted to be remembered as someone who helped. What remains most striking about Lawrence Joel's legacy is not the grandeur of his medal, but the humility of his purpose. He never saw himself as exceptional. He believed that what he did in Vietnam was simply his duty, to heal, to comfort, to stand his ground when others fell. Yet through that simplicity, he achieved what few ever could. He changed the moral vocabulary of the U.S. Army. In his refusal to die, both literally on the battlefield and figuratively in memory, he forced the military and the nation to confront a truth it had long avoided, that bravery knows no color and sacrifice requires no permission to be remembered. Today, visitors walking through the Colosseum that bears his name might not know the full story behind the bronze plaque by the entrance. But for those who do, it stands as a quiet testament, not to war, but to endurance. Lawrence Joel's name lives there not as decoration, but as reminder that one man, armed only with courage and compassion, can hold the line between chaos and survival. And though the jungle where he earned his medal has long since reclaimed its silence, his legacy continues to speak, calm, steady, and unbroken, just like the man himself.